Today we're going to look at the ultimate pen spring mod. That's because I don't actually use pen springs. I use little springs that I pick up off Amazon. This is a box of 246 springs. They are mostly the right sizes for crawler shocks. Some of them might be a bit too big for your application, but I run them inside of my scattergun shocks, which are actually oversized big bore shocks. So why would you do the pen spring mod? Well, the biggest demonstrator is these two Traxxas shocks here. I'm not squashing these shocks, and the one in my left hand is much shorter than the one in my right hand. And what that does is actively pull down on the shock. However, if it needs to, it can still nearly fully extend. The travel is limited by the size of the spring that you put in. This is a standard shock and this is a normal shock, and they can both compress to the same amount, but the pen spring mod will not extend to the full amount. So we do lose travel here, but that might actually be a good thing. To do this mod, you're either going to need a load of those clicky pens that you can steal the springs out of, or you can pop on Amazon and grab a load of springs that are really small springs. And I literally typed in small springs into Amazon. And this has springs that range from 5.5mm width to about 9.5mm width to anything up to nearly 40mm. Now the length's not too important, it's the compressed size that I'm interested in, and we'll go over that in the video. Also, you're going to need a hex driver just to get the top off your shocks if they're a bit tight. You're going to need some pliers, you're going to need a little bit of cardboard, you're going to need some shock oil to put oil back in your shocks, and then you need your actual shocks. And then optionally, some rubber gloves, vinyl gloves, a ruler if you want to be measurement driven, or calipers if you want to measure with calipers. Right, so I've got two crawlers here. I've got the G500 Traxxas TRX4, completely stock. The only modification is the metal servo horn. Definitely get a metal servo horn, otherwise leave them bone stock. They run amazing. And this is my scattergun. So Northwest Scalar Design scattergun. It's like a class 2 comp crawler chassis for a TRX4 that I've kind of pushed to probably class 3 level, but I only use it on the trail and I don't compete. What's interesting here is I've got two sets of stands, which are the Dare to Print crawler stands, and if I put these two crawlers on them, bearing in mind that they are in theory roughly the same chassis, what you will probably see immediately, if I can get these exhaust pipes on, what you can see immediately is even though the scattergun actually has bigger wheels, it has 4.8 wheels, whereas this has 4.6 wheels on. These ones are much lower. Now both of them are being held up by a skid that's around about the gearbox level, but this has much more droop or sag. And the reason for that is this one, this Northwest Scalar Designs one, is running a seriously strong spring inside, pulling the shocks back up, pulling the axle back up. And this is really important for climbing. A standard TRX, if you put your battery on the front, run quite a lightweight body, and set your shocks to the gentlest amount of compression so that it sinks right down, will climb really well. But when it gets to about 60 degrees, what starts to happen is the weight of the motor and the weight of where everything's placed on the chassis starts to make the shocks unload, and your chassis starts to lift. When it reaches full extension, it can't lift anymore. And so the challenge there is it then falls over. And that's where the pen spring mod helps. It resists that natural tip back. Now, on this, I've slammed the suspension, moved the weight super low, and the only thing that really limits me at the moment is traction, because the pen spring mod, even when I pick this up, holds those wheels right up. Now, I can actually pull these wheels quite far down so that they're at full travel, and when I let go, they go back up again. So this is actively pulling the front of the chassis down and keeping it sucked into the hill. Now at the moment I'm running the Axe system. I do have a Holmes Hobbies revolver sat on my desk inside, and I do have a US ESC somewhere in customs, and when I put those on there'll be even less weight on this. And when this thing weighs sort of around about 2.7 kilos with a battery, it's going to be climbing ridiculously well. Obviously I have to make some changes to the geometry and get the best out of it, but the difference is, even though this one is lower, if I hadn't done the pen spring mod, at about 62-63 degrees it does start to just tip. And that's because the front is unweighted so much that the drive from the back wheels is where the weight has been transferred to, because as the front comes up your weight's transferring down and transferring on the back, and then the back ends up overwhelming the grip of the front. As the front's unloading, it just flips, because you're essentially, as a wheel turns, the wheel turns this way, the chassis tries to go that way, and the only thing keeping you down is weight. And when you lose your weight, you end up upside down, and you end up with a broken shell, which I'm also going to do a video on of how to repair, so that's coming soon. Right, we'll clear these down and then we'll take a look at actually doing some of those mods. Right, so we have some shocks here that I've already done. These two are the ones that I've already done, just to show the difference between a semi-droop and a full droop, as well as having two standard shocks, just to show you how to do those options. Hopefully it won't be too complicated, but we'll see. So that's the standard shock compared to the normal, to the semi-droop shock. We can see that it's right at the sort of halfway through its travel. And then this is what I was talking about in terms of max travel. So I'm going to hold these at the top so they're together, and then pull this one down to fully extend it. And we can see that the one with the internal spring doesn't extend quite as far as the one without the internal spring, and that's because the spring sits underneath the piston. So you'll need a piece of card if you haven't got any shock pliers. So this is the droop shock. This essentially doesn't have an outer spring, it just has an inner spring, and that inner spring is there so that when it's full of oil it will naturally sit at the bottom, it will naturally go down to the bottom. But when you try to extend it, you're limiting the articulation by having that spring just giving a bit of progressiveness, in that getting to the top of the travel requires some effort, so you have to really knead that travel. Otherwise it's trying to keep the wheels as level and as flat as possible. In this one, the idea was to reduce the upward articulation, which helps with that tipping back, and also force the travel to stay as low as possible. And actually, because this spring's wound completely off, these tend to sit on the bump stops and then have a nice bit of sort of linear travel, and then as it tries to get through that final bit of travel, it's progressive because you've got a spring fighting against it. It's actually quite easy to do a pen spring mod. We have to remove our spring, remove our piston, and you will lose any oil that's left over. So that's why I'm wearing gloves, and that's why I've got a piece of paper. So what I'm going to do here is, this one's going to be my droop one, because it's easier to take the spring retainer off the G-Made shock. And all I'm doing is completely removing the top retainer, taking off the spring, taking off the bottom retainer, and ta-da! We have a droop shock. But the problem with this is it will stay at its top travel. And ideally what we want is for it to suck itself back in. So we're going to open this up just by twisting the top and pump out any oil. And that lovely black oil demonstrates why I don't use these G-Made shocks anymore, because they don't have the best seals, despite trying to use all the stuff that I've been told will sort the seals out. So we wrap our cardboard around the shock, and that's to stop the teeth on our grippers from gripping too hard, and then we twist off twist off the rod end and wipe off any shock oil that you've leaked all over your table. And then if you don't actually want to lose all of your shock oil, you can just take the top off, keep it level while you're doing the rod end, and then as you push up, hold your finger on the bottom, and then you should be able to pull the top out and retain the shock oil. But I've already bled mine out, so I don't need to worry about that. This might be where you have trouble with certain shocks and pen springs. Now these G-made shocks have a slightly thicker piston rod. And the problem with that is normal pen springs don't always fit round here. So we have our selection of springs. Ooh. And some of them are obviously not going to fit. I mean, the diameter of that spring is about the diameter of the shock. But we do have some choices here. We have these little, just get the card out, have these little 5.5 by 17.5 mil springs. And these give me a 4 mil travel restriction, which means on a shock with 26 mil of travel, I've still got 22 mil of travel. If I want to go full mad droop, I can use these 38 mil springs that when they're compressed, reduce your travel by 12 mil. So that would take you down to about 14 mil of travel. That's actually what I've got on the front of my Proline big bore shocks, because the front doesn't need a lot of travel. That's what's getting up and over things. It's the rear that I tend to let do all the work. And if you watch some of the crawling videos, you'll see it doesn't really hold me back that much. I do high side sometimes on the belly, but it's a belly dragger, so that's just because I haven't gone fast enough. And all we do is take this spring, put it over the piston, pop it in, and now this is where you have fun. You have to try and get a bit of your rod end on, just a couple of threads, because that'll make it easier to pull out. With these massive springs, it makes them really springy. But the benefit of this is, with these massive springs, while it reduces your travel, it gives you a very, very, very active droop setup. And then try and get that cardboard back on. Easier said than done sometimes. And this is where shock pliers would be much, much better, because you'll be able to grip it without having to mess about with a bit of cardboard. But I don't have any of those, so this is what I have. Right. And now, because that spring is so strong, that is sucking that all the way back. But we lose quite a bit of travel compared to the other one that only pulls it back about halfway, but then has more overall travel. If I try and grab these rod ends, yeah, one is much longer than the other. And then if you want a semi-droop one, then all you have to do is put all of your spring retainers back on, put your spring back over the top. Some shocks don't allow you to do this, like the Traxxas, the little rod ends get in the way. And now you have a semi-droop where it will restrict your upward travel, so you now have a shorter shock. That will stop your front end from lifting as much as it can, and that might give you a couple of extra degrees of attack. It'll also guarantee that your truck stays at a lower ride height, which lowers your centre of gravity and really helps you get over all of those things. And as you can see from here, the mainspring is more than enough to overcome that internal spring that's pulling things up. But it's more the travel restriction that's the big benefit for me. And that's really it. If you were doing this properly, you would then get your shock oil, pour that in, do them up, install them back on your truck, and go out and climb. Right, well that's it really. That's all there is to a pen spring mod. You can use the clicky pens if they'll fit over your piston rods, but if they don't, get a box of these. They're around about $8–10, about £10 in the UK if you would get them off Amazon Prime. If you get them off the slow boat from China on Amazon or eBay, they're about half that price, but then isn't anything. Hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like this video, really helps me out. Subscribe for more stuff like this, and catch you next time. Thank you.